Have you ever wondered why a substance as simple, as common, as inexpensive as salt becomes a weapon in the spirit? Why something you can find in every kitchen, on every table, in every home, suddenly becomes a symbol that terrifies dark powers? Because in the realm of the spirit, nothing is ordinary, nothing is casual, nothing is as it appears. Salt is not just salt. It is a mystery coded inside a physical substance. It is a parable in matter. It is a revelation trapped inside something fragile, something natural, and something easy to overlook. And many believers do not understand why the kingdom of darkness trembles at symbols that the kingdom of light has ignored. You can walk into a room where a witch is comfortable, confident, bold, arrogant, whispering incantations, releasing projections, chanting their desires, and the moment salt enters that atmosphere, something shifts. Their composure breaks, their boldness melts, their confidence collapses. Why? Because salt confronts darkness with a message: purity, covenant, preservation, light, integrity, and spiritual separation. And darkness cannot stand purity. Darkness cannot stand separation. Darkness cannot stand covenant. And darkness cannot stand anything that carries a signature of divine order. Salt is not powerful because of its chemistry. Salt is powerful because of the message it carries. You can hold salt in your hand and it will look like a small white crystal, but in the realm of the spirit, it becomes a reminder of everything darkness cannot corrupt. Witches do not fear salt because of the substance. They fear salt because of what it represents. In the spirit, salt announces that corruption has failed. It tells darkness that decay has ended. It tells witchcraft that its manipulation cannot take root here. There are people listening to me right now who do not realize that the battles around their lives became intense the moment they started walking in purity. The purity of your heart became salt. The purity of your intentions became salt. The purity of your worship became salt. And suddenly you notice resistance that never existed before. Have you ever asked why? Because nothing terrifies witchcraft like a believer who has refused to be corrupted. When darkness cannot contaminate you, when manipulation cannot distract you, when temptation cannot reduce you, you become a spiritual salt crystal that irritates the eyes of every demonic agent assigned against you. Salt preserves. Witches manipulate through decay. They engineer the slow destruction of relationships, businesses, spiritual hunger, marriages, emotional stability, and destinies. But salt comes and stands as a barrier, announcing, this one cannot decay. This one cannot rot. This destiny cannot collapse. And when a witch finds a life that is preserved, they panic because their entire operation depends on gradual spiritual decomposition. If they cannot weaken your love for God, weaken your hunger, weaken your prayer life, weaken your purity, they cannot access your destiny. But salt fights decay, and witches fear preservation. Salt exposes. Witchcraft thrives in secrecy. The number one weapon of darkness is concealment. The number one atmosphere of witchcraft is silence. The moment light appears, the moment truth appears, the moment spiritual intelligence appears, their power is broken. Salt is a purifier. That is why when salt enters water, it separates the impurities. When salt enters food, it reveals flavors. And in the realm of the spirit, when a believer becomes aligned, discerning, and spiritually alert, they become like salt, exposing the hidden operations of darkness. Witches do not fear you because you pray loudly. They fear you because you see clearly. There are some people, if their eyes open for just 7 minutes, the witchcraft around their family would flee without a fight, because darkness cannot survive where things have been exposed. But when ignorance sits on a destiny, manipulation becomes easy. So witches fear salt because salt represents clarity, exposure, revelation, insight. It represents a believer who cannot be lied to, who cannot be deceived, who cannot be tossed around like a child. The salt-like believer is not emotional. They are spiritual. They do not move because of noise. They move because of instruction. Salt heals. Witchcraft wounds. Salt restores. Witchcraft damages. Salt carries the power to disinfect a wound. And when a witch targets a person, they often attack their emotions, their relationships, their self-worth, their confidence, their identity. Because a wounded heart is a doorway. A broken life is a gateway. A discouraged believer becomes vulnerable. But salt carries healing in its symbolism. This is why when a believer begins to heal, the kingdom of darkness reacts as if something is being stolen from them. When you begin to forgive, bitterness loses its power. When you begin to release people, curses lose their foundation. When you begin to walk in emotional wholeness, witchcraft loses its legal access. There are families today where the enemy has kept people bound through wounds carried for 20 years. But the moment healing comes, the moment salt touches that scar, witchcraft loses its touch point. And suddenly the nightmares stop. The strange oppression ends. The patterns break. Healing terrifies darkness because only healed people can be used by God in the fullness of their destiny. Salt is a covenant substance. In ancient times, to eat salt with someone meant loyalty. It meant alliance. It meant you cannot fight me because we have shared salt. So when a believer becomes a carrier of covenant consciousness, witches panic because covenant means God has placed his mark on you. It means you are not ordinary. It means you are not accessible. It means you are not unprotected. It means you are not uncovered. Covenant announces that there is a spiritual wall that darkness cannot cross. And witches fear men and women who understand the power of their covenant with God. Most believers underestimate the strength of what they carry. You think because you do not see visions or prophesy or shout during prayer that you are weak. But in the realm of the spirit, your purity is a weapon. Your discipline is a weapon. Your obedience is a weapon. Your consistency is a weapon. Your sacrifice is a weapon. Your holiness is a weapon. Your alignment is a weapon. You have no idea how many attacks you have already defeated just by being separated from the things God asked you to avoid. Salt irritates. That is why when it enters an open wound, it burns. And in the spirit, when a believer who carries purity, covenant, revelation, and presence steps into an environment full of witchcraft, the atmosphere reacts. There are people who dislike you and they cannot tell you why. There are environments where the moment you enter, hostility rises. Have you wondered why? You irritate their spiritual ecosystem. Your presence disrupts the atmosphere. Your hunger for God is an irritant. Your lifestyle is an irritant. Your refusal to bow is an irritant. Your purity is an irritant. Salt changes environments. Darkness hates anything that shifts atmospheres. And the moment a believer becomes a carrier of presence, they carry spiritual salt that transforms every space they enter. Some of you do not know that your presence at your workplace is the only reason witchcraft cannot take over that office. Your presence at home is the only reason that family is still intact. Your presence in that lineage is the only reason ancient patterns have not swallowed everyone. You are the salt that sustains the environment. Salt makes food valuable. Without salt, everything tastes bland. Without salt, everything is empty. Without salt, everything is unattractive. Witchcraft knows that the moment God begins to make your life flavorful, meaningful, impactful, influential, darkness loses control. So they fight to keep your life tasteless, uninteresting, invisible. They fight your influence. They fight your voice. They fight your relevance because salt brings flavor, and flavor destinies attract attention, and attention brings influence, and influence brings impact, and impact destroys darkness. So witches fear salt because salt represents a believer who has become spiritually useful, a believer who has become spiritually positioned, a believer who has become spiritually effective, a believer who cannot be ignored, a believer who cannot be swallowed, a believer who cannot be diluted, a believer who cannot be manipulated. Salt melts ice. And metaphorically, salt breaks rigidity in the spirit. The more hardened a demonic atmosphere becomes, the more salt-like believers melt it through prayer and presence. When you step into a system oppressed by witchcraft and begin to pray, you wonder why the resistance is so strong. Because salt is melting something. Prayer is melting something. Worship is melting something. Fasting is melting something. Alignment is melting something. And when a witch senses a believer who carries this melting power, they become nervous, because every time you show up, something frozen begins to shift. Something ancient begins to tremble. Something demonic begins to leak strength. Your very presence becomes corrosive to their operation. Salt cannot lose its identity. Even in small quantities, it announces itself. No matter what you mix salt with, it still remains salt. That is why witches hate believers who cannot be compromised. They hate believers who cannot be turned. They hate believers who cannot be bought. They hate believers who cannot be discouraged. They hate believers who cannot be intimidated. Because no matter what pressure surrounds you, you still remain what God called you to be. Every time you choose purity over compromise, you remind darkness of salt. Every time you choose obedience over convenience, you remind darkness of salt. Every time you choose prayer over sleep, you remind darkness of salt. Every time you choose honor over rebellion, you remind darkness of salt. Every time you choose destiny over distraction, you remind darkness of salt. Salt endures. Salt survives. Salt cannot be destroyed by time. It is one of the few substances that does not expire. And in the realm of the spirit, endurance is a weapon. Witches do not fear noise. They fear consistency. They fear people who are still praying 6 months later. People who are still worshiping a year later. People who are still fasting 2 years later. People who are still growing 5 years later. Because endurance defeats witchcraft. Persistence breaks cycles. Consistency destroys altars. And the truth is, the reason witches fear salt is because salt represents everything the believer is supposed to be. Pure, preserved, aligned, revelatory, covenant marked, atmosphere shifting, incorruptible, consistent, discerning, healing, influential, and separated. Salt teaches us something profound. It does not need to announce itself to be effective. It does not need noise to function. It does not need attention to influence. You can place salt in a pot quietly, and without drama, it transforms everything inside. And this is the mystery darkness hates. Silent Christians who are dangerous. People who do not talk much but shift atmospheres. People who do not post everything but carry fire. People who do not seek attention yet carry authority. People who speak once and demons obey. People who stand in a room and the atmosphere adjusts. People who have mastered silence but have not lost power. Witchcraft thrives on theatrics, noise, fear, intimidation, shadows, drama. But salt is the opposite. Silent, steady, and unstoppable. And there are some people listening to me right now who have underestimated themselves because they do not shout like others. They do not display like others. They do not announce themselves like others. Yet, spiritually, your presence unsettles darkness more than you realize. You are not loud, but you are deep. Not visible, but dangerous. Not noisy, but effective. And witches cannot predict silent believers because their power does not come from performance. It comes from depth. Salt dissolves. It disappears to function. It sacrifices visibility for influence. It sacrifices appearance for impact. And spiritually, darkness fears believers who are dead to themselves, believers who have crucified the flesh, believers who have surrendered ego, believers who do not need applause to stay consistent. Because when ego dies, authority rises. When pride dies, power increases. When self dies, the spirit takes over. And witches fear anyone who can disappear into obedience, disappear into consecration, disappear into alignment, disappear into prayer. Salt carries a sting. Even when it dissolves, the impact remains. And there are believers whose prayers seem quiet, whose sacrifices seem unnoticed, whose consistency seems unseen. But the effect is so strong that the kingdom of darkness keeps reacting without understanding where the pressure is coming from. You may look simple outwardly, but in the spirit, you carry a sting. You carry weight. You carry influence. You carry a signature that cannot be copied. You carry a presence that cannot be faked. And the kingdoms of darkness feel the effect before they understand the source. Salt is small, yet powerful. It teaches the mystery of spiritual size versus spiritual weight. You may feel small in the eyes of men, but you carry weight in the eyes of spirits. You may not be recognized by people, but you are registered in the spirit. You may not be honored by systems, but you are feared by altars. Witches do not fear your physical size. They fear your spiritual stature. They fear the covenant you carry, the purity you guard, the consistency you maintain. They fear the price you pay in private, the sacrifices no one sees, the consecration no one celebrates. In the spirit, size is not measured by height or age or title. It is measured by alignment. It is measured by obedience. It is measured by purity. It is measured by light. And the more aligned you become, the more salt you carry, the more your presence becomes a disruption to dark atmospheres. Salt also symbolizes wisdom. It is written that conversations should be seasoned with salt, meaning grace, discernment, accuracy. Witchcraft hates wise believers. Foolish believers empower darkness, but wise believers frustrate it. When you walk in wisdom, you shut the doors witches depend on. You close emotional doors. You close relational doors. You close financial doors. You close spiritual cracks. And witches fear anyone who can close doors. They fear believers who do not speak carelessly, who do not react emotionally, who do not open themselves to unnecessary warfare. Some battles you are facing did not start with an enemy. They started with an uncontrolled tongue. Some attacks you are dealing with began with a conversation that lacked salt. And when darkness sees a believer rising in wisdom, choosing silence, choosing discernment, choosing restraint, choosing timing, choosing accuracy, they become nervous because many of their attacks will lose access. Salt also symbolizes separation. When salt is added to purification rituals, it separates what is clean from what is unclean. And spiritually, witches cannot operate where separation exists. They need mixture of beliefs, mixture of lifestyles, mixture of loyalties, mixture of altars, because mixture creates confusion. But when a believer is separated, when their heart is singular, when their focus is pure, when their devotion is undivided, darkness loses its grip. This is why many people experience rising attacks every time they decide to separate themselves from wrong relationships, wrong environments, wrong habits, wrong influences. Because separation weakens witchcraft. Purity weakens witchcraft. Consecration weakens witchcraft. And when darkness senses that you are separating yourself for something higher, they react in panic because they know what you will become once you are fully aligned. Salt carries memory. It holds identity even in hostile environments. You can throw salt into boiling water and it does not lose its essence. You can bury it in the ground and it does not rot. You can store it for years and it remains intact. And spiritually, darkness fears people who do not lose themselves in pressure, people who remain consistent in adversity, people who stay focused in storms, people who retain their spiritual identity no matter what life throws at them. Witchcraft depends on pressure to break people, emotional pressure, financial pressure, relational pressure, mental pressure. But salt-like believers do not break, they remain. They do not lose their identity, they retain it. They do not forget who they are, they become even more aware of it. And this resistance terrifies darkness. Salt is also a sign of value. In ancient times, it was so valuable that soldiers were paid with it. The word salary even comes from salt. So when a believer begins to understand their spiritual worth, when they stop living like victims, when they stop bowing to fear, when they stop acting like they are unprotected, when they stop negotiating their value, they become dangerous. Darkness hates believers who know who they are, because value creates boldness, and boldness breaks witchcraft. You begin to walk differently. You pray differently. You speak differently. You make decisions differently. You stop compromising. You stop apologizing for your calling. You stop shrinking to make others comfortable. And witches become uncomfortable because you have embraced your spiritual worth. Salt can be used to ruin the land of an enemy in battle, making that territory unproductive. Spiritually, this is symbolic of believers who, when they rise in authority, cripple the satanic systems that once operated around them. Your presence begins to ruin altars. Your prayers destabilize demonic patterns. Your worship dries up negative cycles. Your purity cancels agreements. Your authority ruins legal grounds. And this is why darkness reacts so violently, because your rising is destroying something they have built for years. Salt also symbolizes clarity. When it dissolves in water, it becomes invisible, yet the water carries its taste. And in the realm of the spirit, this mirrors believers who may not look extraordinary outwardly, yet everything around them carries their spiritual influence. You may not be the loudest voice in your family, but the direction of the family shifts because of you. You may not be the most visible person in your workplace, but decisions begin to bend around your presence. You may not hold any title in your community, but your spiritual weight influences atmospheres more than positions ever could. Witchcraft fears believers whose influence is subtle but undeniable. People who may not look like warriors outwardly, but move like giants spiritually. People who do not need to be seen to be felt. People whose presence saturates the environment with alignment, purity, and power without announcing themselves. This kind of influence confuses the kingdom of darkness because they cannot trace it to personality. They can only trace it to alignment. Salt carries the mystery of transformation. When you apply salt to raw food, it begins a process that changes its structure and brings out what was hidden. And spiritually, the moment a believer becomes aligned, their presence begins to expose what has been concealed, hidden motives, hidden agendas, hidden operations, hidden patterns. And this is why when some people enter your life, witchcraft around you begins to react. It is because your spiritual saltiness has begun to reveal what was operating under silence. There are environments where witchcraft survived because no one with discernment was present. There are families where altars lasted because no one with purity was born yet. There are systems that thrived in darkness until a salt-like believer stepped in and everything began to scatter. You may not even understand why certain people suddenly dislike you, why atmospheres shift when you enter, why dormant attacks become restless the moment you rise. It is because your presence has started a spiritual chemical reaction. Salt stabilizes. In ancient preservation methods, salt prevented food from breaking down. And spiritually, witches depend on instability to operate. They target your emotions because instability opens doors. They target your relationships because instability creates vulnerability. They target your confidence because instability attracts fear. They target your prayer life because instability weakens alignment. But when salt enters an environment, it enforces steadiness. It announces, this one will not break. This one will not decay. This one will not collapse. And darkness hates stable believers because stability is strength. Stability is clarity. Stability is consistency. Stability is longevity. A stable believer is too predictable for God and too unpredictable for the enemy. Salt is also a purifier. In purification rituals, it was believed that salt absorbs impurities. And spiritually, this mirrors believers who walk into environments and suddenly conversations shift, behaviors adjust, atmospheres become uncomfortable for darkness. Your very presence begins to purify. People who used to gossip around you suddenly feel convicted. People who used to drag you into corruption suddenly become quiet. People who used to invite you into darkness begin to avoid you. Not because you're judging them, but because your spiritual saltiness exposes what they're trying to hide, and which is hate purification, because darkness thrives where impurity is celebrated. They love environments where compromise is normal. They love spaces where sin is casual. They love atmospheres where believers are lukewarm. But when salt-like purity enters the room, the operations are interrupted. Salt burns. It carries pain for whatever opposes purity. And spiritually, believers who carry fire cause discomfort to demonic structures. Some of the battles you face are not because you are weak, but because you burn too brightly. The enemy saw your fire before you did. They saw the consecration you were walking into before you recognized it. They saw the covenant you were about to step into. And salt-like believers cause spiritual discomfort long before they realize their own influence. Salt creates thirst. When added to food, it triggers hunger for water. And spiritually, believers who carry salt provoke hunger in others. Your passion makes others desire God. Your consecration awakens their conscience. Your devotion stirs something dormant inside them. You become a catalyst that pulls people toward alignment. And witchcraft hates people who awaken others. They fear believers who are activators. They fear believers who carry impartation. They fear believers who ignite hunger, because hunger births revival. Salt is foundational. You can remove many ingredients from a recipe and still call it food, but remove salt and everything becomes bland. And in the spirit, there are believers who carry foundational roles. Their presence upholds the spiritual structure of families, churches, marriages, and systems. The enemy may attack everything around, but he knows he must reach the salt if he wants collapse. That is why some people face unusual warfare, not because they did something wrong, but because they are the salt that holds everything together. Salt cannot be replaced. There's no perfect substitute for salt. And in the realm of the spirit, when God positions you as salt in an environment, no one can take your place. You carry a unique assignment, a unique sound, a unique presence, a unique mantle, and darkness fears believers who understand that they are not replaceable, because such believers walk boldly, pray boldly, act boldly, and obey boldly. Salt affects everything it touches. Whether in small quantity or large, it changes environments. And spiritually, witches fear believers who change things without effort, believers whose presence alters atmospheres, believers whose speech shifts realities, believers whose alignment rearranges spiritual priorities. These are people who do not force change, they are change. Salt is a spiritual irritant to anything impure. And when the believer becomes salty, pure, consecrated, discerning, powerful, aligned, everything that is impure begins to manifest. Some of the sudden attitudes you see in people are not natural, they are reactions. Some of the sudden distance you experience is not personal, it is spiritual. Your saltiness forced a manifestation. You irritated something hidden. You agitated something ancient. Salt teaches that influence is not about quantity, but identity. You do not need to be many to be relevant. You do not need to be popular to be impactful. You do not need to be visible to be powerful. A few grains of salt can change a whole meal. And a single aligned believer can shift an entire territory. Salt reveals what was hidden. When you place salt on icy ground, the ice begins to break, exposing what was underneath. And spiritually, believers who carry light disrupt the frozen places in atmospheres. They expose motives, they expose secret conversations, they expose hidden alliances, they expose spiritual transactions that were taking place in silence. This is why some people suddenly become uncomfortable around you. Your presence begins to melt the camouflage they used to hide behind. Salt softens. In harsh environments, salt breaks hardness, and spiritually, witches hate believers whose presence softens hearts toward God. When you enter a place and suddenly people feel convicted, suddenly they feel stirred, suddenly they feel drawn to change, the kingdom of darkness senses danger. Because hardness is the foundation of witchcraft. Hardness of heart, hardness of conscience, hardness of environment. But salt melts hardness, and melted hearts become gateways to revival. Salt increases potency. When it enters a dish, it amplifies flavor. And believers who carry salt amplify everything divine around them. When you join a prayer meeting, the intensity changes. When you step into a workplace, excellence rises. When you enter a relationship, clarity increases. When you become part of a vision, the speed multiplies. When you serve in a ministry, fire intensifies. Darkness fears believers who amplify what God is doing, because amplification accelerates the downfall of dark systems. Salt creates distinction. The moment it enters anything, the difference is unavoidable. And spiritually, believers who walk in distinction are threats. Not distinction based on pride, but on grace. Distinction based on purity. Distinction based on alignment. Distinction based on obedience. You don't try to be different, you simply are. Your presence separates you. Your decisions separate you. Your values separate you. Your walk separates you. And witches cannot stand believers who refuse to blend into the environment, because such believers resist every attempt at spiritual assimilation. Salt is used to seal covenants. In ancient times, salt was a symbol of permanence. And spiritually, the life of a believer who understands covenant becomes unshakable. When you understand that your protection is not emotional, it is covenant. Your preservation is not luck, it is covenant. Your destiny is not accidental, it is covenant. Suddenly, witchcraft loses influence, because covenant believers cannot be manipulated. They cannot be threatened. They cannot be intimidated. They cannot be deceived. Salt removes bitterness. When added to certain substances, it neutralizes bitterness. And spiritually, the moment bitterness leaves your heart, witchcraft loses legal access. Many people don't know that bitterness is a spiritual gate. It invites manipulation. It empowers oppression. It fuels demonic suggestion. But when salt-like believers walk in forgiveness, humility, and release, the bitterness that once gave the enemy access dissolve. This is why witchcraft hates healed believers, because healed believers are sealed believers. Salt represents precision. Too little and the flavor is off. Too much and it becomes overwhelming. And spiritually, believers who walk with precision, accurate discernment, accurate speech, accurate reactions, accurate decisions become powerful threats. Witchcraft survives through misalignment. If they can push you into impulsiveness, they win. If they can tempt you into speaking prematurely, they win. If they can bait you into wrong reactions, they win. But when you operate with precision, you frustrate their strategies, because accuracy shuts down manipulation. Salt endures fire. When exposed to high heat, it does not lose its essence. And spiritually, believers who endure seasons of fire without losing their identity terrify the kingdom of darkness. When you go through trials and still pray, when you walk through storms and still worship, when you face betrayal and still love, when you endure pressure and still remain pure, when you experience loss and still remain aligned, this endurance is salt. Fire reveals those who are merely emotional and exposes those who are truly consecrated. Salt forms boundaries. When placed around soil, it restricts certain growth and allows others. And spiritually, believers who establish boundaries in their lives are dangerous. Boundaries in relationships, boundaries in conversations, boundaries in habits, boundaries in spiritual engagements. Witchcraft thrives in the lives of those who say yes to everything, who open their hearts to everyone, who are every influence. But when your life is salted with boundaries, your spiritual gates become guarded. Salt was a currency in ancient civilization. It influenced trade, value, and negotiation. And spiritually, believers who know how to transact in the spirit through prayer, sacrifice, obedience, honor, and alignment carry weight that darkness cannot understand. Witchcraft hates believers who understand spiritual economy because such believers always rise. They rise when others fall. They advance when others stagnate. They break through when others are trapped. They gain access to things the enemy cannot stop. Salt symbolizes clarity of identity. You never mistake salt for sugar. It is distinct. It is unapologetic. And spiritually, believers who walk in clarity of assignment, clarity of identity, clarity of purpose, clarity of seasons cannot be manipulated. When you know who you are, witchcraft loses its power to deceive you. When you know where you are going, distractions lose their attractiveness. When you know what you carry, intimidation loses its sting. Salt symbolizes spiritual permanence. It carries memory through time. And spiritually, the impact of a salty believer remains even when their physical presence is gone. You leave a fragrance. You leave a pattern, you leave an imprint, you leave a spiritual footprint that continues speaking. Darkness fears believers whose influence outlives them, whose obedience becomes a generational echo, whose sacrifices become a foundation for many, whose consistency becomes a pillar in their lineage. Salt is a symbol of divine approval. In sacrifices, salt was required for offerings to be accepted, and spiritually, believers who carry divine approval because of obedience, consecration, surrender, carry an aroma that darkness cannot corrupt. When heaven has approved a man, hell cannot deny him. When heaven has stamped a woman, witchcraft cannot silence her. Approval from God is a shield. It is a mantle. It is a signature in the spirit that darkness recognizes and fears. Salt represents spiritual irritation to darkness. When salt touches an open wound, it stings. And in the realm of the spirit, believers who rise in purity, prayer, and consecration sting the operations of darkness. Your worship irritates them. Your holiness irritates them. Your consistency irritates them. Your alignment irritates them. Some of the sudden resistance you face is not because you have done wrong, but because your life has become salt to the wounds of darkness. Your very presence exposes their injuries. Salt teaches the mystery of hidden strength. You do not need to look powerful to be powerful. You do not need to appear dangerous to carry spiritual voltage. In ancient times, salt was lightweight, but extremely valuable, highly traded, closely guarded. It was small in size, but massive in worth. And this mirrors believers who do not need crowds to validate them, platforms to affirm them, or applause to strengthen them. Their power is hidden in their walk with God. Witchcraft cannot understand hidden strength. They are used to intimidating those who depend on external validation. But when they meet a believer whose foundation is internal, whose strength comes from secret places, whose power comes from intimacy, not visibility, they retreat. Because nothing is more dangerous than a Christian whose strength is not tied to the world. Salt speaks of spiritual absorption. It draws out moisture, preserves what should remain, and exposes what should not. And spiritually, believers who absorb revelation, absorb instructions, absorb discipline, absorb correction, absorb impartation become spiritually heavy. They cannot be tossed by emotional winds. They cannot be manipulated by false voices. They cannot be deceived easily. Depth becomes their shield. Witchcraft survives through ignorance. But salt-like believers carry revelation that exposes every dark strategy long before it manifests. They are not caught unaware. They pick signals early. They discern movements before they unfold. They sense shifts before they appear. They carry prophetic sensitivity that makes them difficult to attack. Salt establishes presence. When added to a meal, you may not see it, but you taste it. It announces itself through effect, not appearance. And spiritually, there are believers whose impact speaks louder than their visibility. You do not need to fight to be seen when God has ordained you to be impactful. Witches fear believers whose influence is not tied to physical platforms, but spiritual essence. These are people whose words carry weight, whose prayers shift atmospheres, whose decisions ripple through realms. Salt warns. When placed upon meat, it prevents decay, signaling that something valuable is being protected. And spiritually, the presence of a salty believer in a territory becomes a warning signal to darkness. Careful, this ground is preserved. Careful, this family is guarded. Careful, this person is covered. Your presence becomes a spiritual alarm system. Dark spirits may probe, but they cannot invade. They may attempt, but they cannot succeed, because your saltiness announces preservation. Salt carries dominion. It determines the flavor of everything it touches. And spiritually, dominion means you set the spiritual climate wherever you are positioned. You determine the atmosphere of your home. You determine the climate of your workplace. You determine the spiritual tone of your relationships. You determine the boundaries around your destiny. Witchcraft hates believers who walk in dominion, because dominion takes away their ability to influence. When a believer carries salt, they become the thermostat, not the thermometer. Salt symbolizes endurance. It does not spoil. It does not decay. It does not break down under time. And spiritually, this mirrors believers whose faith outlasts seasons, whose consistency outlives storms, whose devotion transcends challenges. Witchcraft depends on fatigue. If they can tire you, they can weaken you. If they can frustrate you, they can distract you. But when you carry endurance, the cycles collapse. Salt resets environments. When applied to contaminated water, it purifies it. And spiritually, believers who walk in purity carry the power to reset atmospheres. When you enter a place where gossip was normal, it stops. When you join a family where confusion ruled, clarity enters. When you step into a relationship where manipulation existed, alignment appears. Your presence resets the spiritual climate, because purity carries authority. Witchcraft fears spiritual climates they cannot manipulate. They fear homes soaked in prayer. They fear hearts saturated with scripture. They fear minds filled with light. They fear environments where God's presence is the atmosphere and not an occasional visitor. Salt speaks of precision in warfare. It was used in ancient military strategies to weaken enemy territory, sabotage crops, and render land unusable for demonic planting. And spiritually, believers who are salted know how to target their warfare. They do not fight blindly. They strike accurately. They pray with intelligence. They engage with precision. They dismantle foundations. They uproot altars. They cut off legal rights. Their warfare is effective because they fight from understanding, not emotion. Salt neutralizes poison. When added to certain toxins, it breaks their power. And spiritually, this mirrors believers who cancel word curses, neutralize evil projections, dismantle accusations, and reverse negative declarations. When a salty believer speaks, poison loses power. When they decree, darkness withdraws. When they declare alignment, chaos dissolves. Salt symbolizes clarity of boundaries. When used in rituals of separation, it marked what belonged to whom, and spiritually, witches hate believers who carry spiritual boundaries, who know what thoughts are theirs, what emotions are theirs, what battles are theirs, what assignments are theirs. Boundaries prevent confusion. Boundaries prevent manipulation. Boundaries prevent infiltration. Salt symbolizes spiritual taste. In other words, your presence makes environments meaningful. Without salt, food is tasteless. And without spiritually awakened believers, families lack direction, systems lack righteousness, friendships lack depth, workplaces lack integrity, communities lack transformation. You are the meaning carrier. Your presence gives significance to environments that would otherwise remain bland. Salt symbolizes discernment. It helps identify imbalance. Too much, and it is overpowering. Too little, and it is ineffective. And spiritually, believers who walk in discernment Know how to navigate relationships, assignments, conversations, and opportunities without excess or deficiency. Witchcraft thrives in imbalance, but salty believers neutralize their influence by walking in spiritual accuracy. Salt carries the mystery of permanence in influence. Even after leaving a room, your effect remains. Darkness fears believers whose impact echoes long after their physical presence is gone. You enter a place once, and the atmosphere shifts for weeks. You speak one sentence, and it rearranges someone's spiritual journey. You pray once, and doors open for years. Because salt does not leave when it dissolves. It remains in effect. And now, hear me as I bring this to a close. Salt is not just a substance. It is a reminder that darkness is never as powerful as it pretends to be. A reminder that purity still intimidates wickedness. A reminder that when a man or woman carries preservation, covenant, and divine identity, no manipulation of darkness can stand confidently before them. Salt teaches us that value is not in noise, but in essence. You don't have to announce yourself. Just remain aligned, remain pure, remain consecrated, remain valuable, and the works of darkness will speak for you by retreating on their own. Every time you see salt, let it remind you of who you must become. A person whose presence corrects corruption, whose life purifies atmospheres, whose character frustrates wicked intentions, whose spirit carries the weight of divine backing. Let it remind you that evil does not fear size. It fears authenticity. It fears substance. It fears light. It fears a life that is in covenant alignment with God's order. So rise with the understanding that you were never designed to be intimidated by darkness. You were designed to be the salt that unsettles it. Step into your relationships, your home, your business, your destiny with the consciousness that you carry something that makes darkness uncomfortable. Guard that purity. Protect that consecration. Maintain that fire. Because when your life truly becomes salt, when your spirit truly carries authenticity, you will not need to announce anything. Darkness will recognize it and step back on its own.